Whoa, mind blown. Everything you just saw was captured on the Razer Kiyo Pro Ultra, the same camera that is recording me in my natural habitat for my A-roll set. And I'm not gonna say, and this is gonna replace all DSLRs out there, but it is coming very close to replacing certain cameras that are more expensive, that require a lot more setup, and this is a very good thing for the webcam community. To be honest, setting up all the shots wasn't super difficult. I got a few weird stares of like, what are you doing in the forest with a laptop, a tripod, a webcam, and the cable? But the main thing, it was just awkward. But anything to get the shot. All the indoor shots were straightforward of me maxing out the shutter speed and lowering the ISO so that we could eliminate any ambient lighting and only use my tube lights for that really stark visual effect for lighting. For the past few weeks, I've been testing this camera and honestly really impressed with the color accuracy or the white balance situation. And even though I would not run this on auto in terms of white balance and exposure and autofocus here, I would say, is like the weakest point. It's constantly hunting for my face, and that focus range in that exact middle, about like, you know, from 1 meter to 1.5 meters, is way too short. You know, you can have a lot more granularity when it comes to the far away focus and the really macro focus, but when it comes to this, we don't have that much of a range, and so that's why when it loses focus, there's that immediately visible hunting. Now you may be wondering, how is this type of depth of field is achieved? So first of all, we have a massive sensor on here, the Sony Starvis 2, so 1/1.2 inch sensor. It's very large. That gives us that natural depth of field, plus an aperture of f1.7, which again, in the photographer terms, it's a really fast aperture, allowing us not only to get really good depth of field, but also really good performance in low light situations. A few things you have to keep in mind is that this thing has no optical stabilization whatsoever. So me lightly tapping on the floor, you can see the camera is shaking. At 4K 30, the sharpness is absolutely incredible. The detail this webcam captures at the proper focus is awesome. But even though I do have it set at 1/60th shutter speed, it's still not as smooth as I would like, and it's nowhere near the smoothness that you can capture from a standard DSLR or a mirrorless camera. The other big elephant in the room, of course, is the price point at $299. All the footage that you've seen so far, do you think that is worth it to you, of being able to plug it in, open OBS, and just start recording without, you know, too much hassle and get a really fantastic image quality out of it? As you can see in this type of setup that is a bit more streamer-like and a bit more moody and dark, it delivers perfectly in terms of sharpness. And I do have it set on auto white balance right now, which gives me perfect skin without blowing out neither the blue or the purple lights. And that is very impressive. We do have a privacy cover on the webcam. You flip it on there and it disables the video functionality. The audio, unfortunately, is still being recorded, and you can see by the LED at the top. And the audio quality is nothing crazy. It's a good soundtrack for reference to syncing with other better quality audio sources, and that's all it's there for. In terms of lighting, I did have to set up a little bit. Of course, as with any camera, you do have to balance out your ambient lighting, your key lighting, your something in the background, for example. But in terms of color definition, as I'm looking on the screen right now, everything is really, really good. My skin is perfectly pink. I'm not too yellow, not too pink. I'm just right. My guitar in the background looks like that in real life as well. And all these boxes that I put out here for the white, for the green, for the yellow, for the blue, the plant over there and over here, everything looks as it should. And for a webcam that I did configure myself in terms of the ISO, the shutter speed, the white balance, and all the exposure levels, that is very impressive for someone who likes to play around with all that stuff. But when it comes to auto things, that's where things get a little bit dicey. This is an example of everything set to auto: exposure, white balance, and autofocus. So if I'm stationary, it would be fine, but as soon as I get out of that zone, it's gonna find me, it's gonna do that focus hunting. As soon as I'm back again, it's gonna do the same thing. And because of that focus pulling area for this type of distance is so short, you're gonna definitely see that focus hunting, especially if I turn around and I come back again. It's just not as perfect. In terms of white balance, I think it does a generally good job, a little bit more on the greener side, so it's an easy fix in post-production. And exposure-wise, that's why I keep it on manual, just so that there is no variance throughout the beginning of the recording till the end, both in exposure and white balance shifting as well. But in general, I think Razer does a good job making sure the white is proper white and not leaning towards the pink hue or the green hue. This is an example of autofocus when I'm really close to the camera, about maybe 30 centimeters away. So it does a really good job in the macro level, but in terms of autofocus, when you need it to be stable and not constantly hunting around, make sure to go manual. Now this is an example of 1080p 60. In terms of color, it's slightly more muted, less contrast, but that's an easy fix in the software. The only thing you have to make sure to enable is 1/120th of the shutter speed in Razer Synapse. The Razer Synapse software doesn't automatically double your shutter speed based on your frame rate, which I think it really should, to make sure that we have that fluid motion and nothing is stuttering. Here I went with manual exposure, white balance, and autofocus to make sure nothing is jumping around, nothing is shifting in terms of color and exposure. And I think for 1080p 60, this looks very nice and fluid. I keep looking to your left just because that's where I have the laptop set up, and my goodness, the depth of field and slight roll off here is very impressive for a webcam, even in 1080p mode. Looks good. Now, when it comes to settings for the Razer Kiyo Pro Ultra inside Synapse, there are plenty of things to take note of. So first of all, everything has been reset to their default settings. So this is what you would see if you were to turn this on with some fairly good lighting in my studio. The first thing I want to do is go into the camera setting, and I want to make sure that our exposure is set not on the average, because I don't like how things are kind of being blown out in the background and my face is a little too bright. So I would go to the metering on the face, and you can see now it uses my face to make sure that the exposure compensation is acting accordingly. The second thing I would do, if you don't need autofocus like I've showed earlier, you can also see it's being, a little bit hunting, is to go into manual focus and just bring it in over there. This looks great. For example, if you have RGB tubes in the background, you can choose the lighting type to be stylized. That would highlight the RGB-ness and make sure that everything is properly exposed as well. In processing, so here we can choose our resolution. 4K 30 is our maximum. You can do 1080p 60 to give you a little extra fluidity without destroying the color science that they're seeing. It'd just be slightly less resolution. For MPEG quality, if you go into manual and you can max it out, for example, if you don't have limitations on the hardware recording and encoding and stuff, and this is what I would do, for example, just max it out. And look what happens when we go to performance. It basically just completely kills our recording bitrate, and there's way too many artifacts. As you can see, like this is totally unusable. So definitely make sure to record everything into high quality if your hardware allows. Lens distortion compensation, I would definitely keep on because it keeps all your lines straight. If we disable it, you can see there's going to be a lot more bowing both in our vertical lines and horizontal. But if you're a tiny square on the corner, for example, and if you want to get slightly wider field of view, then potentially leave this compensation disabled. I do like that we do have noise reduction that actually works very well. So for example, let me disable it. So there's going to be a lot more noise in my skin to highlight more texture, which potentially might work in your benefit, but you can see there's noise behind on a chair, for example. If enable 3D, that disappears. And if we go 2D, then my skin is slightly smoothed out, and I do really like this look. The last thing is HDR. So this allows for additional light sources that are potentially behind you to be slightly more actually, let me go into bright room. So because we are in a fairly bright room, and so HDR definitely brightens up the space. And if you do have any bright sources, they will come in back in proper exposure. But I actually prefer HDR to be disabled because I find there's a bit too much latency when HDR is enabled. And finally, in the image tab, you can customize different settings. So I would lower the contrast, for example, if I'm shooting in a really bright scene outdoors. I had to do that in order to bring back some of that highlight information. Unfortunately, the white balance toggle isn't very friendly because sure, we have this line, you can choose between cool and warm, but we don't have the hue adjustment between the green and the purple. And so for example, if I want my wall to be in this level, you can see I'm way too purple. So going to the auto fixes that for me, which is great, but I would love to be able to do that myself. And the last thing, we can see all these settings that we have configured at the bottom here, ISO, our shutter speed, our noise reduction, etc. And you can save these settings onto the camera, which is fantastic. So that way, when you open this in OBS, everything that you've just set up in Synapse will be saved onto the camera, and you can go ahead and start recording. I think the takeaway here for me with the Razer Kiyo Pro Ultra is that it's going to redefine how we look at other webcams, and really hope that it's going to push the boundaries of what type of quality we can extract from a webcam with a large enough sensor. So software and processing is one part of it, but also making sure that the hardware is right, and I feel like it is definitely right here. So from everything you've seen today, what are your thoughts on this webcam quality? Let me know in the comments down below. I'm Dmitry. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you in the next video.